Hi, this is Trevor Conquergood. Welcome to this week's R&K Software Club's video for the week. And the topic for this week is about resizing designs and how to know when you have, I guess, the best type of stitch. And so I'm going to just go ahead and click on our custom shapes library and open up a little piece of artwork. This one's a baseball bat. And so what I'll do is decide from the bottom of the screen, what style of embroidery to put in. So usually one of the biggest or most popular ones is the standard fill. The thing with the standard fill is that it covers the whole shape. And it puts needle points kind of in the body or throughout the fill of the shape. So this is great for larger shapes. The one thing you do notice right away when you make it a standard fill is the little black dot here. That's actually showing me where the last stitch or where it finishes sewing is. And so there's your underlay. And then you can see the top stitching is kind of broken into two halves. And the reason for that would be, if you select the shape, is that here in the sort of shape tool, you can see the entry point where it starts sewing and the exit point where it finishes sewing. And of course, the inclination line of on which direction, should the thread go. And so if I made it kind of like start and stop at the bottom like this and pressed enter or apply on the sort of properties box, it would change the way the design would stitch out. So now it's going to start in sort of the bottom and sew across the shape because I changed the angle, and it sews kind of from one side to the other because we move the exit point to be on one end like this. And that's great. If the baseball bat was going to be smaller, and if it was quite a bit smaller, then, a satin stitch might seem more appropriate. And really, satin stitches are great because they allow the thread to kind of show off a little bit. And so a satin stitch, meaning instead of using a pattern fill, you can use a satin fill. And when you use a satin fill, the software only puts stitches on the outer edges, but not throughout the kind of body. And you can use your standard fill tool to make a satin, but there's also a whole series of satin path tools. And so the satin path tools are a little bit different from the standard fill. Your standard fill, what really makes it a standard fill is the fact that when you use your shape tool, there'll be only one stitch direction. And you can set it on any angle, but it's all one direction, and you can't add second or third sort of stitch directions. And that's very different when you take this little satin stitch like this and you turn it into a satin path. So you've got auto satin path over on one side and the kind of the manual satin path on the other. And then all the ones in the middle are kind of the decorative ones, gradient satin path, fancy satin path, contour satin path, this kind of thing. And so if I click on auto satin, what it does is it inserts, the software decides where the inclination should go. And you'll notice that the stitches are now kind of changing in direction a little bit, because if I look with the shape tool now, you'll see that there's more than one of these yellow inclination lines, and the software's decided to put one here. Now that doesn't mean that we can't come along later and say, well, actually I don't really want it to turn into that corner, and I'm going to move the entry and exit and stitch angles and kind of change the way it sews out. And so it's really up to you, but the point is you can control it. So if you want to change the angle of the stitches for any reason, and usually when we're changing the direction of the stitches, it's to create realism in our embroidery designs. And so this obviously doesn't seem quite correct. When you do it like that, you're like, why are the stitches sort of going back and forth like a seesaw? And it's because the angles, or the inclinations, have been set to make it do that. So auto, when you click on auto, so for example, if I select the shape and then just click over on the little yellow star at the bottom, that's like an eraser, right? That goes right back to the original piece of artwork. It has no stitching assigned to it. And this time, instead of clicking on auto satin, I'll click on regular satin. And so now it allows me to click and drag to insert one or more stitch inclinations, and if you wanted it to have sort of like a turning effect, you could make that by just adding as many inclinations as you want. If you don't want them, you can move them after you've put them in, and of course you can delete them as well. I think to delete them I'll need to finish making it first and like come back and delete them. I'm not sure, let me see. Yeah, because if I right click over top, there's no, oh no, I'm wrong, delete inclination, so I can take them off right now. But at the end of the day, when you right click, it finishes making it. And so just to do it again quickly, click the eraser. So when you click the Satin Path tool, it waits for you to draw a minimum of one inclination line. You can also interact with so you right click, now you can move the exit point and the entry points, and when you right click again, now you get the stitches. And so that's kind of how it works. So when you use the Satin Path tool, you can make a satin, it kind of comes up with satin by default, but you can still go in and make it a pattern fill. And so understand the difference between the Satin Path tool. Notice that I've got two baseball bats here. They're both done in a pattern fill. I know one's smaller than the other, but notice on the right, one is a fill and one is a Satin Path. And by default, the difference is the standard fill will only allow you to select one stitch direction. And the Satin Path will allow you to assign more than one. And so I can right click and say add, and put another one in if I want to, and click enter or apply to make that change. And so really either tool can make a satin stitch or a pattern fill stitch. There's a third option. When you go with the Satin Path, notice that in the properties box, there's also an option in the tabs of the properties box. There's one called the split tab. And when you go on the split tab, you'll notice that by default, my Satin Path has come up with a random split. Now, if I make it larger, so the thing with the random split is it says don't make any stitches smaller than 1.2 and don't make any longer than 7. And so as long as this column, what we're talking about right now is the width here, and there you can see some showed up. So let me just undo that, or here, go smaller. See, there's no splits going on. And if I measure across the shape, kind of where the stitches are their longest, which is affected by the angles, it says 0.24 of an inch. So I'm just going to switch over to metric for a minute so I can read them in metric. And it says that they're 5.8. So notice that the split option is set at 7, but if I set it to, let's say, 5 and click apply, notice the split. So from up to this point, there's no splitting because the stitch length is not longer than 5. But as soon as we got to here, that must be if you measured right there, that stitch is exactly 5. And so the next one becomes, 5.5 or whatever, longer. And when it's longer, it will therefore split. And the thing that's neat about splits is, so it kind of keeps it looking like a satin, but it gives it now that's a random split. So there are other options. For example, so random kind of makes where the needle points fall. If we turn on the needle points here, you'll notice that they're not all, I'm just going to turn off the 3D and see how they're kind of like varied or randomized, because another option that you can select is like a middle split or an absolute split, or a percentage split. So with absolute and percentage, you'll type in like an amount. With the middle, it'll go right down the middle. So if I say middle split for anything longer than 5, then all the splits fall in exactly the same sort of needle point. And so you get quite a defined line that way, right? It's like very definitely kind of split right there. Whereas when we had it with the random, it gave us the ability to kind of make it less noticeable is what it is. And so random split. And so I kind of bring this all up because they're options for when you're filling in shapes. And, where I think this comes up a lot. And so maybe what I'll do, I'm just going to make this smaller, because what I'm trying to say, where I think this comes up a lot, in fact, let's turn off the split altogether so there's none, is when you open designs that we purchased. Two, I guess, ways that I'd like to show this. And one is with a design that you purchased. Another one is just with simple text. So here's the crux of it. If I bring up text by default comes up as a satin stitch. So here's your text. And it doesn't matter what font you choose, but let's just choose a nice bold block style font like that. And so everything looks great. However, you maybe have seen this in the past when you resize your text and you bring it larger and everything still looks good. However, at some point, and it's probably getting close now, you'll notice something change. There, I can sense it happening right now. You're like, what the heck happened to the top of my letter M? So remember that we have letters that are set. Now you'll see the letter, the settings for your embroidery for the lettering is not on the text tab, not on the text extra tab, but on the fill tab. So when you go to the fill tab, you can see it set as a satin fill. And the problem here is if I use my ruler and measure, you have a stitch that goes all the way to the top of this M is like all one stitch. And notice it's right there that it's like they seem to disappear. Well, they're not actually gone. If you turn off the 3D, the machine still, the program will still make stitches that go back and forth. The issue here is they've become really long. And there's a jump in between. So the satin stitch by default goes across the shape. And here's the problem. As soon as they become longer than 12 millimeters, there is a physical limit. It's not a software limit, it's the machine's limit. Your actual embroidery machine will not be able to stitch a satin stitch that sews longer than 12 millimeters long. And so if you're sewing on like a typical kind of home embroidery machine, those stitches would end up being missing. Okay, if you have a commercial machine, it'll stitch them, but they're very long. And so what the software is telling you here is, hey, you need to address this. You've made these letters significantly larger than they were intended to be. And if we measure them, they're like, 63 millimeters tall. And if I look at the font, like if you click on this little question mark here, it tells me that this font's really only intended to be used between sort of like 10 millimeters and 76, which is between 3 inches and kind of like, under an inch. But that I've gone, kind of to this maximum size now, and I'm starting to run into problems. And that's why the limit really is there, because technically I could make this text even larger. The only thing is I get more of this sort of stitches missing. And the solution is to come to your text tab and change it to be a patterned fill. And that will add all the stitches back in. Now you can also add the splits, but notice on a text segment, we don't have the tab for doing the satin splits. And so if you really wanted to apply satin splits, you can do it. But what you have to do is get your text all set the way you like it, the font, the size, everything, and then right click and you say break up text. So notice right now that on the right I have one text segment, but if I click break up text, now we're going to have an M and a Y and a T and an E. But that M is now a satin path, and because it's a satin path, we have the tab for the, automatic split. And so if I come in here and say, let's give this a random split and make the maximum be, 7 or something like that, and click apply, now I have to go back to the first tab because it's still set on a pattern fill, but if I change it to satin, we'll get a satin with auto, random splits. And so it gives, I'm not saying one's better than the other. There's just different ways that you could make the stitching apply in the letter M. One way or another, the letter M at 4 inches tall is going to be too long to be a standard kind of satin stitch, and you need to understand how you can change it. And so essentially, if you're doing text, probably the easiest thing is just to take your text and change it to a standard fill. The standard fill gives you that very smooth, kind of non-textured look. If you go to a satin path with a satin split, it allows the thread to still look nice and sort of lengthy, and it allows the sheen of the thread to show a little more. And what it does is it puts these, unique kind of like splits in the letters. Oh, that was the wrong one to turn off. There. And you can see that it creates a different texture. There's not one that's right or wrong. It's sometimes you like it this way, sometimes you like it the other way. What I wanted to show you, so that's one time I see this coming up a lot for people, is with text. The other time is just with resizing designs, especially the designs that you purchased. So let's just pretend that these two little baseball bats are a design that you bought. So File, Save As, and maybe you saved it in, maybe you purchased it in PES or JEF or VP3 or VP4 or whatever format, some kind of an embroidery format. And so when you open it up and you look on, and I think I saved that to my desktop, Design 1 PES, and if I say open, now I forgot to point out the magic checkbox, right? Because notice that I didn't check it, and so it kind of brings in the whole design as stitches. And you can do things like change its color or resize it, but it won't. The software will keep the original stitches exactly as they are. If you want to open up designs and make size changes, then you need to select them and choose the Convert to Outlines. So the software doesn't, the PES file does not have outlines or shapes of any kind. It simply has XY coordinates on where to move the needle. And so the software looks for a pattern, and it probably said, aha, that looks like a run stitch. To us, it's really the underlay of the baseball bat, but to the machine, to the software, it would have said, I see a pattern. That's a run stitch. Now we see the fill, stitch of the baseball bat, and the software would see a pattern in that, and it'll make a shape for each time it finds a pattern in the thread, it creates a shape. And the cool thing about that is now you can take these baseball bats and you can select them, and notice up at the top you've got 2,518 stitches, and if I make this larger, that stitch count goes up. Now it's 3,195. How does it do that? Well, because the original baseball bat, if I look at the sequence of it, well, there was a run stitch, so a lot of that underlay became a run stitch, and then another run stitch because it somehow got sensed that there was a break in the pattern, maybe when it was changing directions, and another bit of run stitch. So it didn't know. All that underlay became 3 pieces of run stitch. Now the fill stitch. See how it recognized the fill and it made a shape for that? And then you'll have a few little stitches. That's probably the tie off that, it wasn't sure what that was. So it just made a little thing that says stitches. And so, and then it goes again. Another run stitch, another satin path this time, and then the stitches. And so, because the software has this ability, it means that you can make changes. You can select that fill. Well, it's all grouped together, so let's ungroup. You can select that fill segment right there and come in and see, oh, look, it's set for a 0.52 density. I want it to be further apart, so I'll make the number larger. Instead of 0.5, I'll make it 0.6. And I click enter, and those stitches spread out. So this is kind of the cool thing about it. And this is what I think, and this is kind of coming back to our topic of today, is sometimes you need to learn, if you take this small baseball bat in your design, and then you resize it to be larger, you get those splits. Now, sometimes the splits are not by default turned on. Oh, they aren't turned on, they're turned off. So let me check that. The satin path, yeah, it's got a random split on it. So what I was trying to say is I see a lot of times we open up designs and the software won't necessarily put the random split on for you. And so you end up seeing a satin stitch that's just missing. So if you ever notice the stitch is missing when you're like making things bigger and smaller, the reason that's happening is because the stitches have become too long. If you've measured them ever, if they're under 12, they'll stitch out. But as soon as they're over 12, the software will actually show them as kind of like a gap like this. And so you just notice that at certain amounts that you increase it, you start getting a gap. Now you've got that similar situation where you have to find that satin path that's got that kind of missing stitches. If you turn off 3D, instead of being missing, it shows them as a dotted line. Can you notice how it kind of has a different look to it? So the dotted line says there's jumps in between. It goes, if I turn the needle points on again, it goes stitch, jump, stitch, jump, stitch, jump. And so that's why the software is hiding those stitches. And that's an indication to you that you've made a really long satin stitch and you might want to change it to be a patterned fill. Or if you really like the look of the satin and you didn't want the pattern fill in the small areas, you could leave it a satin, but go to your split tab and make sure that it has a random split turned on it. And so just a few little tips for you guys today on sometimes these things come up when you're resizing lettering or when you're resizing designs that you purchased and opened, that they may need to have a change to the type of stitch. And so I hope you enjoyed today's video. Hope you're having a wonderful day. Until next time, bye for now.